Hey everyone, welcome to the KreatureKid channel and the mold making section of the Pumpkinhead monster. So in this video, we're going to talk about the steps we did to make this giant fiberglass molds to our wed clay sculpture. So what we do is we start with the finished sculpture. How do we go about molding a sculpture this big? We knew we wanted a latex casting, just stippled in with some foam, polyfoam ran inside. We know we didn't want to deal with a bunch of seam line cleanup. We only needed one pull out of this thing. So we wanted to just get it done in a day. So what we start with is we start with a shim wall that we put up. So what this is it's thin aluminum. So we get this roll of thin sheets and we cut it into little squares and we bend and cut our keys. As you can see, there's 5 keys we put on this head. And what that is it's creating it so when we put our two halves of the molds together, there's little keys that lock it in place so that it doesn't just like slide, right? And what we're doing too is we're using aluminum tape to tape the seam lines of the sheet metal kind of button against each other, just to make a nice flush thin metal wall where we're gonna have our front half of the mold and our back half of the mold. Now once we have our shim wall all the way done, we spray the whole sculpture down with Krylon crystal clear gloss just to kind of create a thin plastic film. When you put your epoxy resin on, it kind of beads up because it's all shiny and glossy, right? There's no bite to the sculpture because of the gloss crystal clear. Then we get a matte finish, Krylon matte, and we matte the whole thing. And what this is doing is it's giving it a kind of a thin, grainy texture that grips the epoxy resin so it doesn't bead, right? And then we hose it down with Man 200 from Smooth On. This is basically a spray wax, kind of like a greasy wax. What we're doing is we're just building layers to keep the water from affecting the resins, as well as making it so the clay can easily come out of the mold. So we wax the whole thing with Man 200, and then we also use a blue wax in a can, and we blue wax the shims. We also say you do a sculpture and there's resin eyes. We'll blue wax the eyes. Just another layer of wax to prevent hard materials bonding to the resins we're making our mold out of. So once the sculpture's released and waxed and ready to go, then we move on to our first layer, which is applying epoxy coat. Now, epoxy coat is our detail surface resin. This isn't structurally sound. If we were to just do a mold out of epoxy coat and like try to remove it, it would crack and crumble. This is an epoxy resin capturing all the detail of the sculpture. Now with the detail layers, this is where you got to make sure there's no air bubbles trapped inside of any of the nooks or in the teeth, right? Fine details. You're gonna get little air bubbles everywhere, and those will show up in your casting, your final casting, and you'll have to remove the bubbles and things like that. So we brush on our epoxy coat, thin layer, and then we use the air compressor to blow the epoxy coat into the crevices and in the details, making sure there's no bubbles. Applying this coat, you really got to keep in mind where bubbles might get trapped. Make sure they don't get trapped in there. We do a thin layer of epoxy coat all over the shims, all over the sculpture, and we let that set up to where you can push your finger in and it leaves a fingerprint, but it doesn't stick. And then we apply a second layer just to give it a little thickness so you don't have paper thin areas where glass might accidentally come through the layer of epoxy. So we do a second layer, same thing, let that set up, but not all the way. And then we go in with our freeform air from Smooth On. We've used freeform air to do finished sculpture pieces. Abaddon from the Onyx movie, both his hands and his feet were sculpted out of freeform air because it's an epoxy putty that gradually firms up when you mix the two components together, and you can sculpt into it. You can sculpt with water, you can add details, you can paint on top of it. It's a great painting surface, and there's no weight to it. So what we're using this material for in a mold making aspect, you can see in some sections there's like big gaps. Even with the epoxy coat, there's like big crevices where when we lay fiberglass and resin on top of that, it's gonna be impossible to try to get that glass tucked in that little nook, right? It's just gonna be a pocket of air. So we use this freeform air to stuff in the nooks around areas where the glass might not contour to the shape of the sculpture. So we put it in the nose crevices, in the ear crevices, around the border where the shim's inserted into the sculpture, around the keys to reinforce them a little bit. Basically just making our epoxy covered sculpture a bit rounder, a bit easier to start applying layers of glass on. So once we have our freeform air placed everywhere and our epoxy coat is setting up, that is where we start going in with our first layer of fiberglass. We're using kind of a nasty fiberglass. There's also fiberglass cloth you can use, which is a little bit cleaner, a little bit more expensive. But we're using traditional just fiberglass, the same material that you make boats and cars out of. So we get the fiberglass and we are laminating it, soaking it up with a liquid resin. And that is what binds it to the epoxy coat, what binds it to the freeform, and what binds it to layers to build up layers of this liquid resin, fiberglass hard eggshell that we're creating that we can drill and move around and throw around, right? So we start applying a layer of fiberglass and then mixing up our resin. Now the resin we use is epoxamite. Epoxamite is a laminating resin. Again, 2 parts, part A, part B, mix it up. And now that chemical reaction is heating this thing up. On a hot day, you can mix this up and it sets off within 10 minutes. Now epoxamite comes in a slow, medium, and a fast. We use the medium. It's kind of a nice working time. It starts heating up about 10 minutes after mixing in your cup if it's a large amount. So what we do is we are dipping our brushes and we have a whole row. We pre-pour and pre-measure all our cups of resin. We cover them in tinfoil, all the A's, all the B's, and we start tapping our first layer of glass. Once we tap all that out, tap all the air bubbles out, saturate this fiberglass in clear in liquid resin. Then we lay glass for a second layer. Once it's all laid everywhere, we know the whole surface is covered. We go in, we mix another cup of resin, and we start tapping and saturating that glass again. And we are just building up layers of thickness. Normally for a mold, we do 7 layers, 8 layers, 6 layers. I've done 4 layers, that's a little thin. It also depends on how thick your fiberglass is. Glass is sold in different thicknesses. You want a mold that's about 1/4 of an inch thick, maybe a little less, to give you that strength, to give you something to hold on to. You know it's not gonna crack or flex when you try to remove it from the mold or when you're struggling to open it. So we build up our layers of glass, and then once we build up 6, 7 layers, we're done. We let that sit overnight, we let the chemicals react, and in the morning, it's as hard as a rock. And we have our finished fiberglass mold. Now is the step of trying to open this giant fiberglass eggshell we created. We start with trimming all the excess off, giving ourselves a nice, pretty edge of this thing. And then we drill our holes, because we don't want to open it and then be like, all right, let's close it and figure out, like, now our holes don't line up. How come you're screwing it together? What do you know?
Oh.
We gotta open it, buddy.
Oh, yeah.
Then we start putting shims, little pieces. We get like paint sticks and we cut them and we bevel them a little bit. And we have little pry points that we put in there with clay. So we can get in with some screwdrivers and separate those 2 pieces of fiberglass with a aluminum shim in between. And we need to crack those apart so we see our aluminum. And then we start working pieces of wood, wedges of wood, to start opening this thing up, forcing this thing to pop open, right? So we just wedge and hammer, slowly pull these 2 pieces apart. What ended up happening is there's so many nooks and crannies here, all the clay just hugged inside of this piece. Because we have a giant cereal bowl full of textures, it's all just gripping that clay. So we're just tearing the clay off of our chicken wire armature. Once we pry this open and we get it out, then we rip out the chicken wire, we rip out the wood, and now is the process of, we have 2 half cereal bowls of a mold that are full of clay, and we gotta hog all that clay out. Start scooping it out, start peeling it away. Now cleaning out a mold is never fun, but it's part of the job. We just sit there with sculpting tools and hack away. You get a pressure washer and you start spraying this thing down and getting all this water-based clay out of there. If your sculpture is out of Chavant or an oil clay, you gotta scoop all that out, and you gotta get some solvents and scrub it out, and you get your molds completely clean, because you don't want any clay or any residues inside of the silicone or latex or whatever material you're running inside of this mold. So now that our mold is cleaned out, ready to go, we bolt it together, and we start thinking of, all right, what's our materials? How are we gonna go about casting this thing? What we do to run the latex in the fiberglass mold is we just stipple thin layers of latex in the mold and just hair dry it. Let it dry. It's a lot of sitting around, a lot of waiting, and you're just drying thin layers at a time. We just brush in our layers, we build up a thickness. Once we feel like that thickness is pretty good, then we're into running polyfoam inside of that head, because obviously if we just pull this latex out of that giant mold, it's just gonna be a big floppy bed sheet.
Dump it.
Dump it?
Just dump it.
The whole thing?
Just dump it all right in the middle. Scrape it.
We need to put some foam in to help hold the structure. Now the polyfoam we're using to fill the mold is flex foam at 6 and flex foam at 8. We kind of use what was lying around the shop. Both of them are slightly different consistencies of softness. These are pillow soft polyfoams.
Now this is a little denser than 8, so we're going to use the 6 for now, and then we'll switch to 8.
So what this means is it's 2-part components. You mix your part A and part B, and this chemically starts swelling and foaming up. Different flex foamants have different ratios of how much they floof up and how soft of a floof it is. 6 and 8 are a good kind of like pillow soft, squishy, feels like, it kind of just feels like a pillow, feels like foam latex a little bit. So we mix these up and we are pouring them inside of the latex. Now, a little tip we're also doing, just because sometimes the polyfoam doesn't want to stick to the latex, is we just sprayed a light mist of Super 77 spray. Now this is a spray glue, and what it is, it just helps bind the polyfoam to the latex just a little bit better. And now we're running sections at a time because we don't want to like make a solid head, right? So we're just running a little bit of polyfoam here, let it swell up, let it set up, rotate it, run a little bit here. So we're kind of creating a nice, even as we can, thickness of polyfoam within this whole giant head, because we know we want it hollow, because we have to open the mouth, we have to fit a person inside with a helmet and the whole thing. Once we have our foam set up on both sides, we stippled a little more latex around where the shims are, and then we close our sculpture. Now what we did is we avoided putting polyfoam like at least a couple inches from the edges of the molds. So when we close our molds, we can look inside the neck hole and stipple latex, bonding both halves together, hair drying it. And then once that's done, we, through the neck hole, pour a little bit more polyfoam and connect these two halves together.
I don't know, maybe just cap it, thicken the neck up, and then we'll just get it open.
Okay.
See what happens.
Would you say cap it?
Just like pour a batch in
Okay.
there, covering that latex. I would say in a couple hours we can open it then.
Okay.
We don't want to tear it open on the seam, so we gotta start working it out like this. Getting it started. Okay. Ooh. Whoa, doesn't that look good? Now once that's done, what we do is we simply unbolt the head and we carefully peel out the latex foam sculpture. What we do, we use a little baby powder, just because sometimes raw latex, especially like when it's thin on the shims, wants to kind of curl and it like sticks to itself, might even like become permanently stuck to itself. So the baby powder is just a way to kind of release the latex and make sure it doesn't bind to itself. And we just gently pull this thing out, and then we have our latex polyfoam pumpkin monster head. I hope you guys like this video. Thanks for watching. So the next step is, now that we have our latex head, we have to trim it, we have to seam it, and then we have to R&D how it's gonna fit on someone's head, And then we can start getting into painting this giant beast, which I'm really excited about. So thanks for watching. Please check out the next episode. If you haven't already watched our previous episode on sculpting, please do. Ask any questions in the comments, and thanks for watching.